Chapter 4. Gangland. By the time I was in my mid-teens, I was fully aware of a very real presence and activities of the gangs that effectively run Bury Park and in turn Luton, certainly in respect of the criminal enterprises which involved mostly drugs and prostitution. There's not much about the name Gambino that induces nostalgic thoughts of Pakistani Kashmir, machine guns in New York, and the old family home in Sicily, maybe. Gambino relates to most people as pure mafia, but the self-styled Gambinos of Luton were at the forefront of the Pakistani gangs that took over the town through the 1990s. The Reds, the Raja tribe, the Yellows of the Chowdhury and Jats, and Khawajas, Khans and Ghaffurs, they all fought for control of their patch and whatever was going on in and around it. Drugs, prostitution, robbing, fraud, money laundering, you name it. I've read that these Muslim gangs formed originally to defend Bury Park from football gangs, Luton Town's Kenilworth Road ground being right in the middle of the patch. For sure, the club has its own groups like the Bolts and the MIGs, men in gear. Members of my family were influential figures in the MIGs, and when I gravitated towards the footy, as I got older, I was right in that world. Which came first, and which initiated the violence, however, the football gangs or the Muslim ones? I'm not so sure. The reality was probably that for both there was relative safety in numbers. Exactly how that translates into the Muslim gangs running industrial levels of drug trafficking, prostitution, protection rackets, and lots more, as close to a scaled-down model of New York mafia as you can get. Someone a bit cleverer than me will have to tell you. You might have noticed by now that I steer clear of calling these communities and gangs and groups Asian. I see that as one of modern Britain's biggest first, most politically correct cop-outs. I'm not talking about Asian people, as in Chinese or Japanese, Vietnamese or Korean. Whether from Pakistan or Bangladesh, these communities and groups are defined by their ideology, which was and is Islam. They were all Muslim, which to my mind makes it most accurate way of describing them collectively. It's what broadly defines their own identity. So I really don't understand why we get so uptight, so sensitive about the word Muslim to describe a community. Most of Luton's Muslim communities came originally from Pakistan, and within that specifically from Kashmir. And as I understand it, from them, the tribe is everywhere. That would obviously have a lot to do with how the fractions and the gangs in and around Bury Park and Luton at large developed. Some years later, two gangs of lads who had all gone to Charlie Boys' School got into a massive brawl that left one young man, Wajid Khan, battered to death. They were from two gangs called Runley Road Boys and Saints Boys, who had been rivals when they were at school, but who continued to feud on for years afterwards. One night they went at it with everything from cricket bats, baseball bats to matchets, and a Samaria sword. Apparently Khan was the leader of the Saints, and he and some pals were cruising around Luton in a car, tooled up with weapons, when they run into the Runley Road Boys, and it all kicked off. When Khan's pals legged it, he was smashed about 30 or 40 times and died from his brain injuries. The Runley Road gang members admitted the attack, although they only pleaded to manslaughter, saying that they were provoked. How long do you think they got for smashing a young man to death with a bat in the middle of a street? Life? 10 years maybe? You're kidding, aren't you? The longest sentence handed down was 5 years. One of the thugs got just 3 years for his part in killing that young man. I got nearly that long for lending my wife's brother a deposit on his house. There was another killing in Luton, in not too dissimilar circumstances, which obviously outraged most local people. The cold-blooded murder of Mark Sharp. Mark was 37 and was on his way to get a takeaway in 1995 when he had a bit of an altercation with some blokes in a car who cut him up. He flipped the V sign at them, and there were 4 of them, and he was alone with his young son, but they still rang for reinforcements before they set upon him right there on Hightown Road. All of them were armed, metal bars, parts of a snooker cue, and they battered and battered Mark on his knees before one of them finished him off with a knife in his head. Even when he was down, they kept on kicking and stamping on him. He hung on for 4 days before he died. 2 of his attackers got life for murder, but 3 of the others were acquitted of murder and were given just 4 years for manslaughter. The judge told the jury they could downgrade it to manslaughter if they felt Mark had done and said something enough to make a reasonable young Asian male act. Can I ask you something? What has Asian got to do with anything, even though it wasn't Asian but Muslim? It was a something and nothing moment in a car. It happens in every town every day, but these characters still had to call more of their mates and murder a bloke in cold blood, and the judge felt he had to find a way to let them off easy by inviting the jury to find an excuse for their behaviour. That was a turning point for a lot of local people. A few years ago I was in Hemel Hempstead and got talking to a man. It turned out he was a close friend of Mark Sharp, and after the case he and his family moved away from Luton. He said a lot of people did. They still are if the truth's told. Non-Muslims are fleeing at a rate of knots. It was interesting. That man made the point that no one commemorated the murder as a moment in time as a social landmark, like they did with Stephen Lawrence, race murder. They were both totally random racial killings, but one was clearly as far less important than the other. Everyone in Luton remembers the Mark Sharp murder, but violence from the Muslim gangs was an everyday occurrence that everyone was having to learn to live with. Not only after Mark was killed, there was an incident that brought it really close to home. One of my cousins merely lost his hand because he was stabbed in a confrontation with some Muslim blokes in the town centre. He was rushed to Luton Hospital. I can remember all my aunts and uncles coming up to the house. News was filtering through what had happened, and when they heard that it involved Pakistanis, everyone in the house was like, oh no, they're going to have gone to town on him. His hand was literally stabbed through, but you could say he was one of the lucky ones. I suppose these things were bound to have shaped me in some way growing up, hearing the stories and experiencing the reality of life on streets that simply don't belong to us anymore. You can't help but have it touched your life in some way or another. It was around then, when I was about 12, that me and some pals were going into the main Luton swimming pool, which was over near Bury Park. My mum used to say, no eye contact with the Muslims. Really? Put your head down. When you go past the Muslims, when you go out of your area, it was one of the first times I was allowed out with my brother and his friends, Roy Fratter, a big black lad who was older, 16, and his younger cousin Wesley. The Fratters were a big family with a big reputation in the area. One of the other older brothers had recently been shot dead. Wesley moved to Cutter's Green, near us, and we had been allowed to go to the swimming pool as we walked there. Probably a 2-hour walk, about 5 miles home. It was in the Bath Road and the other side of Wardown Park at the back of Bury Park. There were about 6 or 7 of us, and we came across a group of around 15 to 20 Pakistanis just hanging around near Wardown Park. They asked who we were and where we were from, and the main one, the gang leader, said to leave them two, indicating Roy and Wesley. Well, everyone knew who the Fratters were and the reputation they had. You mess with the black lads and you could expect repercussions. The rest of us were fair game, though. They mugged us, spitting in our faces, calling us white boys, white pigs, knocking us about, and then searching us, taking our money. I was probably the youngest, and my brother and his mates were a bit older, so they were the ones being physically beaten up. They took my brother's hat from him for some reason. They searched us all and took our money. That was the first time I'd come in contact with a big group of Pakistani lads. The first time, not the last. If you want to go out and about Luton, you run the gauntlet of these kids of confrontation, simple as. Later, when we started going to another 18s disco, we used to walk through Hightown, through the train station to the town centre, and you were taking a chance every time you made a trip. I got mugged twice one night, but then almost every white kid got stopped and robbed at some time or another. When my mother used to give us money for the youth group, we had to hide it in our shoes under our socks because we knew they would be stopped and patted down by these lads, these men. Some time later, I was on the fringes of the Luton town football scene. I went to the game against Rochdale and saw a bunch of older blokes stopped a gang of Pakistani lads. And they made them take their shoes off and give them a few slaps saying, "This is what you lot are doing to our youth. Don't feel nice, does it?" Looking back, and although I never thought about it at the time, belonging to Luton town football supporters, football hooligans even, was the way a lot of young black and white lads formed their own gang. There was only ever safety in numbers. If you were out and about in Luton, and unless you were part of some gang or other, you were vulnerable. For me, not just with my interest in football, but with members of my family being part of the Luton town scene. I suppose it was only natural that I gravitated towards that gang. I'm not going to pretend that I wasn't excited being in a big crowd of mates, having a ruck with lads from other clubs. I suppose I was a bit scary-eyed, and listening to the stories, all the rivalries and fights and running battles between hooligan outfits. Once, when we were staying at Auntie's, lots of blokes came round to watch the video, CCTV coverage of the Luton against QRP game, where trouble broke out. Was it attractive because I was young and impressionable? Possibly. It sounded glamorous and exciting. These men belonged together, had a brotherhood of their own. They had something special, unique to them. I don't suppose it's any different from any other number of gang affiliations, or the kind of things young men are drawn to the world over. Always has been. I was about 17 or 18, and on my apprenticeship, when I was first allowed to go away on my own to watch the town game, it was to see them play at Mansfield. And I got such a buzz after watching things kick off, even though I wasn't involved in it. For my 18th birthday, we hired a 52-seater bus to go for a night out in Watford, which might not have been the best idea a group of young blokes ever had, because Luton and Watford have always had fierce rivalry. We sat down in a pub, and a lad strutted in wearing his flash gear and said, "Who's from Luton then?" And that was it. It was on. Only about half a dozen lads made it home on the bus. It was tribal, just like when you were in school, just when our school would fight another school. Our kids from different estates would confront each other, Luton and the football, just because another extension of that. I was going to the games with the lads, my own age, and they were all willing to stand up for each other. That was a tie. That meant something, although it came to an abrupt end for a long period in 2001, after a now notorious Luton battle with Watford. It was chaos. The game was on a Tuesday night. We all met up at 10 or 11 on the morning in London in order to head back to Watford. There was probably 250 or 300 of us. The police tried to block the railway station off, and it was then that I heard the chants, "Migs, Migs, Migs," like a big roar. It sent a shiver down your spine. Everyone ran through Watford, and when we got to the ground, it was all kicking off. We went into the ground, and there was no police presence, because they were all outside, dealing with the trouble kicking off there. The Luton fans ended up on the pitch and went straight over to the Watford end. The match had to be stopped for 15 minutes, and it was all over the news. The full-scale football riot. Excited? You got caught up with the frenzy of it, the adrenaline of it. For certain, it was a massive buzz. At least it was the brief time that it lasted, no later. Everyone was running backwards and forwards, and people got caught up in the madness of the moment. But when everyone calmed down, it started very quickly to dawn how stupid it all was. I was properly scared, because I had the apprenticeship, which must, as I wasn't happy with a lot of things about it, I really didn't want to lose it. My mum would have gone through the roof, for starters. As tiny as she was still a gaffer, still is. After that Watford game, I was talking to one of the other apprentices at work about the buzz from the game, except this time what had always been for us like pretty much harmless turned out to be something extremely serious. Suddenly, people's doors started being busted open, and the police piling in behind. I think 18 lads went to jail for their part in the Watford brawl, and I really didn't want anything like that. It became clear that if people were identified in any way as part of the Watford riot, they were going to go to prison. One of the lads, an old friend of my brother, got 12 months just for kicking a bottle on the pitch. 12 months for running on the pitch, chanting and kicking a bottle. I remember seeing a picture on the paper, and one of the blokes looked a bit like me. I was properly shitting myself. I was a bit podgy at that time, and even ended up losing a lot of weight. I'm not sure if it was a conscious decision to not look like that bloke, but it was a massive wake-up call. I've never been much of a drinker at that time, and I didn't do drugs, even though I hung about with people and groups of lads on Friday nights. One of the gangs would smoke drugs, get pissed, and get into plenty of trouble. But although I got along with them in a sociable manner, I would always step away from that stuff. I always kept my head on straight, back then at least. After that Watford game, with lots of friends finding themselves in court and worse, I got a full-scale reality check. I pretty much stayed away from the football until I finished my apprenticeship. A lot of the lads stayed away from the game altogether until all of the Watford trouble had blown over, and then fates conspired against me, and I ended up in jail anyway. I've managed to successfully finish my apprenticeship, but my career was finished before ever it really got started.